You are listening to the Let Me Overthink About It podcast, where I dive into a series of topics that occupy my anxious mind. I'm Sam Madore, overthinker extraordinaire. This week, I'm overthinking about what's on your mind. And it's just me, myself, and I. Enjoy. This week, I am overthinking all by my lonesome. I like to do this at least once a season. And so this is my first time overthinking on my own for season 4. And I decided to do things a little differently this time in preparation for this episode. I just threw out on Instagram that I was looking to do a solo podcast and I was looking for some questions. So if you were interviewing me for my podcast, what kind of questions would you ask? And so I did get lots of responses, which was really great. So thank you to everyone who submitted. I'm going to try to get to them in this next 40 minutes. If I don't get to your question, my apologies, but I am just going to work my way through. And true to form, I haven't really overthought this episode too much in advance because I want the questions to be answered organically and to feel like we're just kind of having a conversation on the fly. So bear with me as I work my way through these questions. And I look forward to hearing how you guys feel about this format as I'm doing it a little different. So I'm going to get started with a simple one, actually. It was one that's near and dear to my heart as an avid reader. One of the questions that was asked was, what kind of book do I like to read? And, you know, I love to read. I am a hoarder of books. I don't often part with them. Having said that, I do like to lend them out to folks, but I do always want them back because unless I was really like, I don't really like this one, but that's rare. I just like to hold on to them. And in fact, if I was scanning around the room, you would see where I'm sitting. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, I have tons of books in this room and I do have a hard time just parting with them. The books that I like to read, I do love a good self-help book. I'm a little bit of a self-help book aholic. I have a lot. There's quite a few that I've purchased that I haven't read, admittedly, or that I read and I kind of pick up and I thumb through and I wait for something to sort of jump out at me. I love to highlight books that I read, particularly self-help books where it's like, okay, when I go back to this, I'm going to remember that these highlighted pieces are the things that really stood out for me. So that is one genre that I like. And I also adore biographies. I do like nonfiction too. I do like fiction too. I always get that confused the first time I say it. I do enjoy fiction, but I veer toward nonfiction. I do appreciate biographies and kind of finding out where folks are in their lives and what led them to where they are, or how they got to where they are, and sort of the ins and outs of their childhoods. I love reading about people's childhoods. My sister just gave me a book for Christmas, and it's Geddy Lee's biography. And I'm not a huge Rush fan. I do enjoy Tom Sawyer. I'm not going to lie. I'm not a huge Rush fan, but I love the thought of reading Geddy Lee's book as a Canadian icon and a hugely successful musician. So that's the long-winded answer to that question. I promise I won't take as much time on all of the others. I'm going to skip around. So, because some folks submitted a few questions. So, when one is in the weeds of depression and anxiety, how do you communicate to your support network where you are in your psychological safety? And that's a big question, and one that's a bit tough to answer because I think it depends on the person and it depends on the support system that you have. And I think I want to preface this entire episode by saying this is my experience, and I've been very lucky in my journey through my mental illness, through depression and anxiety and various ups and downs, that I've had an immensely incredible support system throughout. And so my response to this question in particular is going to be quite different to somebody who hasn't had that type of support in their lives. And so I recognize that privilege that I've had to be able to be open and honest in certain groups and the workplace and in friendships and relationships. So I hope that that's the case for you. And I just want to preface any question that I'm going to answer around mental illness to say, like, I have my own experience and you have yours. And I hope that some of what I say resonates with y'all. When one is in the weeds of depression, how do you communicate? And I think I hate the answer, it depends, but that kind of is the answer. It depends on who your support system is and if it's somebody who gets it. You certainly don't want to open yourself up to a situation where somebody does not get it, and they end up making you feel worse about your situation, or not in a safe space to be able to share your experiences in that moment, and then also in future interactions with them. And I find that's the case with some folks, some well-intentioned folks who are your support system, or are your friend, or are your colleague, and they want to support you, and it's evident that they do, but then sometimes will say the wrong things. So if you do put yourself out there to say, I'm struggling right now, or I need to talk, and I just need somebody to listen, I don't need advice, I think setting those boundaries in those conversations is really important, because a knee-jerk reaction for a lot of folks on the receiving end of that is to say, oh, but you have so many good things, or, oh, why don't we just go for a walk, or something that might feel a little bit flippant, and again, is well-intentioned, but feels flippant. And I think if you manage your expectations in advance, but also communicate those boundaries, then that person will have a better understanding. It blows my mind, because I've lived with a running narrative in my head all the time, my entire life. And so it shocks me sometimes to learn that other folks don't have that, and have the capacity to turn inner voices off, or they never had them to begin with. And so I think we need to help the folks on the receiving end by communicating exactly what's happening, and trying to be really clear with them to say, I'm struggling right now, and I'm not seeking advice. I'm just seeking somebody who can listen, or, I'm okay, but I just need some space. And just managing those expectations and setting those boundaries is really key. And I think I saw there was another question that had come in as well around boundaries too. So I'm going to skip to that one. What have the past years shown you about boundaries? And it's funny, because setting boundaries is one thing. This is one thing I've learned about boundaries. Setting boundaries is one thing, and is great. Communicating them is that next step, and that is the key. So it's great, oh, I've set boundaries and I have these great boundaries around myself, but if you're not communicating those to the folks around you, then you might as well not have set them in the first place. So it's really important. It's awkward conversations, it's uncomfortable sometimes to have these conversations, but I think it's also super important to have these conversations, because otherwise you're just assuming that people know that you have those boundaries. Like if I say I can't come, or if I communicate to you that I'm really struggling and that all I want is some space, but you don't say that clearly to somebody, then they could be very confused by that and still think that you're looking for a helper. So I've learned so much about boundaries in the last little while, and how sometimes it's the simplest thing. It's like, I have to tell myself, that person isn't in your head. As silly as that sounds, it's like, that person does not know what you're thinking. As much as your world revolves around you, everything's about me, all of those things. It's like, sometimes I actually have to remind myself, like, no, that person doesn't know what you're thinking or how you're feeling in this situation. Even when you say it clearly, or how it feels like it's clear to you, that person could still be very confused by that. So I think it's important to have clear communication and not make any assumptions about what somebody knows about you, or about how you're feeling in that particular situation. And every situation is different, and so that's why it's even more important when you have those key supporters in your universe, to be clear in each of those situations, because one situation might be different from the next. And I just want to say too, like, this is hard, because if it's as simple as, like, you don't want to go out, you don't want to be social in the certain setting, you don't always, in my mind as somebody who struggles with anxiety and depression, you don't want to always be quote unquote the downer. So you don't always want to have that conversation where you're explaining to that friend, listen, I don't want to go out, but it's not you. It's just that I'm having these anxious feelings and I've just been struggling and You don't always want to be that person to communicate that. But at the same time, when you're struggling with your mental health, it's also important that you explain that every time, because every time is different, like I said, but also you don't want them to think that you don't want to be included, because then that starts this vicious cycle of not being invited and not having your voice, your opportunity to say, I do want to go, or I don't want to go for this reason. And then feeling like they are making the decision for you. So they've just stopped including you in those things, or they stop asking you. I think it's so important to set those boundaries and have those conversations. Please don't stop asking, because I may want to go next time. This is not personal to you. This is personal to me. And, in this moment, I'm not set up to be in a situation where I can be social with, large groups or whatever the situation is. But please don't stop including me, because man, that's a hard feeling the next time when you're not included, as somebody who's struggling with their mental health. So, but again, on the flip side, if you don't say that, then maybe people don't know. That was a really circular way of answering those two questions, and I hope I did them justice, but communication is so important, and that's why I started this podcast, and that's why I continue to have difficult conversations with friends and with myself and on this podcast, because the more you do it, the more comfortable you get doing it, and it can be so hard, but it's so important, and then it just becomes more natural as time goes on. And I think there was a question too, I'm just looking down here, from someone who had thought, what drove you to start thinking I need to start a podcast about mental health and wellness? And that kind of blends in well to what I was just talking about. When I first decided to do this podcast, I overthought it forever. I think I've shared that before. But when I first pulled the trigger on actually doing it, it was in the pandemic, and it was out of, I think, probably loneliness. Yes, I had my family that I would chat with and friends, and, you'd talk on social media and on Zoom and whatever. And my husband, of course, and my doggy. But I really wanted to have conversations about mental health. I always knew that leading up to it. But then when the pandemic hit, and when my mom died in March, right when the pandemic hit, I felt lonely. Like I just needed that connection with people in sort of a deeper way. And so I finally just pulled the trigger. The concept for the podcast came well before that, but and I want to say too, and I think I've shared this before, I wasn't ready at all to do it. I had sort of researched what equipment to use and that sort of thing, but I certainly wasn't fully ready for it, but I just kind of pulled off the Band-Aid and did it. And the whole point is, and I don't want to say I'm making light of mental illness by the title, Let Me Overthink About It. It's kind of funny at the first time you might hear it, but I do want to make sure that the conversation about mental health is woven into just normal conversations, just regular everyday conversations, because when we talk about stigma and ending the stigma around mental illness, that's exactly what I want, is that it just comes up so naturally that it doesn't have to be a big deal. It's just part of the makeup of our conversations in general. So I think that's what I wanted these conversations to be. Yeah, maybe we start the topic is dancing or whatever it is, but rooted within that conversation are little pieces and nuggets about mental illness that just come up organically. So that was the motivation, and we're still here. So I'm pretty excited about that. What does a good mental health day look like versus a bad mental health day? It's a good question. And I feel like the answer goes back to, I don't think there's a full day necessarily. I think it's moments some days where, I tend to share, mornings are better for me. I'm recording this in the morning because I knew that, by afternoon I might not have the capacity or drive, motivation, whatever you want to call it, to do it. So for me, oftentimes it's moments. But when I'm talking about good mental health moments, it's when I feel clear and I feel like I have capacity and I feel like I am enough, which is, I don't think I ever outrightly say, oh, I feel like I am enough right now, so I'm going to do that. But it's, I guess, when I don't feel like I'm not enough, if that makes sense. So, oftentimes when I hit that wall at like 2 p.m. or 3 p.m. or whatever it ends up being, it's like a switch is flicked and I start to question all of the things, the decisions that I've made. My brain kicks into overdrive and I start overthinking all of the things that I've said and done, and, you know, questioning my capacity, my abilities, my, um, uh, I, it just becomes that Rolodex. I know I'm aging myself by using the word Rolodex, but Rolodex of negative thoughts that just kind of feed into one another. And a good mental health day is when I can say, I'm going to go for a walk, and I actually get up and I actually do it. A bad mental health day is when I say, oh, I know what I need to do and I need to go for a walk, but I'm, you know, I'm fill in the blank negative thought about myself because I'm not doing it. And then it just becomes this cycle of negativity piled onto myself about why I'm not doing it and why I'm useless because I'm not doing it. And so often the bad mental health days are the days that I let myself talk badly about myself. And it always, I was going to say often, but it always turns into that negative spiral. Now, on the flip side, a good mental health day could look like a bad mental health day in terms of maybe I'm in bed. Maybe it's like, I can't function today. I can't get out of bed. But that could still be, in some cases, a good mental health day if I don't let that define me. Like if I don't hold that against myself that I'm having a day that I have to be in bed. I think equally as important to actually going and getting out and exercising and going for that walk and recognizing the things that I need to do and actually doing them to feel better. There's also equally as important is recognizing that I don't have the capacity to do that, but that's okay, and not beating myself up for it. Because when you struggle with mental illness, there's going to be those days where you can't fill in the blank, whatever that is for you that particular day. But if you can find a way to make it okay in your mind, to have those moments in your day where you are struggling, because this is an illness, this is a disease. When you have those moments, it's okay to not be okay, which sounds so cliche, but it legit is okay to be where you are. And on a good mental health day, you recognize that for yourself and get the rest and reset that you need. And sometimes I know I do, sometimes we forget that piece of it, that is actually still doing right for your mental health when you're resting and taking that time to reset. It's funny because the other day, I don't know if you guys have watched the show Extras with Ricky Gervais, but I was thinking about this because, you know, when people talk about, oh, what do you do to make yourself feel better when you're feeling like shit or whatever with your mental health, and it's always like, go for a walk, read a book, like, you know, dance party in your kitchen is one that I always say. And I stand by that. Moving your body absolutely 100% will shift your mental wellness, no matter what, in some way or another. So anyway, I was thinking though, on those days when you're like, okay, I'm recognizing that I need to go for a walk. I'm not in a headspace or whatever to actually go and do that, but I am going to recognize that it's okay for me to sit here and not do it, or watch TV, or, you know, stay on the couch or whatever, put the blanket over my head, whatever that looks like. But you can still, in that moment, wherever you are, still find ways to shift your mindset without going for a walk. And it can be, I'm not saying, I want to preface this, I'm not saying this is a fix. I'm saying that in the moment, this can help. Humor is huge. So going back to Ricky Gervais, you're probably wondering why I dropped that nugget. So the other day I was like feeling it. I was in it. I was useless. I was thinking about all the things I had to do, beating myself up because I wasn't doing any of those things. I was classic procrastinating, negative spiral. You're useless. But instead of, and what often happens in these situations, if you experience this, is you just go numb. You don't actually do anything, which obviously makes it worse. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go on YouTube and make myself laugh. So there's a scene in Extras with Ricky Gervais where Ricky Gervais's character is in a bar and David Bowie is there, and David Bowie, he ends up feeling like he's confiding in David Bowie. And anyway, David Bowie turns around, goes to his piano that's sitting right there, and he starts writing a song for Ricky's character in the moment. But it ends up being this really like horrible song. Like he's just making fun of him basically the whole way through the song. And it is one of my favorite scenes on television ever. And so I just went on YouTube. I searched that, like David Bowie, Ricky Gervais, extras. I searched that scene and I watched it and I made myself laugh. And I think obviously that doesn't fix my mental illness. It doesn't, erase the feelings that I had about, not being good enough in that moment or not doing any of the things I'm supposed to be doing, not being productive. But it shifted something in my brain because it was a switch that I was able to flick where it was like, stop taking yourself so seriously, stop being so down on yourself, make yourself laugh. And it just turns things around in that moment. Maybe it only lasts for the amount of time that the video lasts, but maybe also it ends up making you shaking yourself out of it and being like, okay, stop. It's not that serious. And then maybe you're going to start doing it. Put your timer on and start doing one thing that you can do on that list. So as silly as that might sound, sometimes the simplest thing is the thing that's going to help you in that moment. So I just wanted to throw that out there because it literally just happened the other day. And I encourage everybody to look up that scene, especially if you're a Bowie fan. It is absolutely hilarious. He's so funny in it. Another question, and I'm just kind of skipping through, as I said, one goal for 2024, and this actually helps with my mental health too, is I do create a word of the year. I am one of those people. I don't know what that means necessarily, but I do create a word of the year. And this year, my word is create. And the reason for that is actually some of it came back to my conversation with Tara Thorne in my first episode that came out this season, and where she said, and I can't remember who it was, said that you should create one small thing every day. And I loved that because, again, it's a nugget that you can hold on to. It's not like some big, you got to create this giant thing. But if it's like, maybe I write a line of that book that I want to write, or maybe I, reach out to somebody that I want to create an opportunity with in the new year, or whatever that is, if you can just create some kind of small nugget. And so create is my word. I have a long list of things that I want to do creatively, and they're the first things to go to the back burner. So I really wanted to make sure that by continuing to go back to create, that word, an action word too, I was very intentionally choosing an action word, that I can go back and remind myself that, oh yeah, this is the year that I'm going to actually, make that happen. Similar to when I finally pulled the trigger on my podcast back in 2020, but in other ways, and the other projects that I keep sort of talking about, but don't actually start. And so create is my word. And that's a goal for this year, is to actually finish some of those things that I've started. There's drafts and things of all kinds of creative things that I want to pursue. And so this year, create is my word. I'd actually love to know too. I love hearing other people's words of the year, goals and stuff like that. And January isn't really the time for me. Like, I don't think of January as like, obviously it's the new year on the calendar, but I always think of September as the time when it's like, okay, I'm shifting routines and I'm doing different things. January isn't that for me. I think it's because it's like the dead of winter and it just feels like a bit gloomy and whatever. But I think in September is when I more tangible, probably because we're conditioned to start school and, go to university or whatever that is in September. So I think that's kind of where my brain goes, but that's not to say that I don't find, comfort in having things like a word of the year or having something that I can refer back to when I'm feeling a little bit in the weeds with my depression or anxiety. I'm going to read this question. If you recall the first time you were overthinking about something, for example, as a child, and if that same theme or trigger has carried on throughout your life. Whew, that's a good question. And I don't know if I remember the first time I was overthinking. I know that for sure I was an overthinker for a long time before I knew exactly what that meant in particular. And I associate overthinking a lot with anxiety. And so when I say that, I'm referring mostly to my anxiety. So I had anxiety, but never knew what it was. Like for the longest time when I was a kid, And really not until I was an adult did I learn that that's what I had. And I could go back to those moments where I was younger and was like, oh shit, that's what I was doing. I was, having an anxious moment or anxious thoughts or experiencing anxiety. So a lot of my anxiety when I was a child, and this is all upon reflection, because I certainly wasn't aware of this at the time, had to do with fitting in and comparing myself to other people and that sort of thing. So, and yes, the answer to the second half of that question is yes, it is something that is still a trigger to me now. It is absolutely something that comes up still in therapy sessions that I have with my therapist. And the whole comparison culture is a huge thing for me, sadly, and I do feel like, and I've talked about this many times with many different guests that I've had on the podcast, where, the older you get, it does become better. That side of you that needs to be a certain thing or fit into a certain mold does get better. But there are moments, and I think particularly with somebody who struggles with anxiety, where it just gets out of control. It can be one small trigger, one small thing that can make you spiral into those feelings of not enough or not fitting in or not, being who you think you quote unquote should be, which just, I think you all, if you've been listening to my podcast, all know how I feel about the word should. But regardless of how I feel about the word should, I still allow it into my vocabulary, into my day. And so it absolutely is a trigger for me. Fitting in, having friends, having, deep, meaningful connections, and sometimes not seeing the connections that I do have because of thinking that there's some other ideal out there that I don't have. So focusing on that negative piece of what I don't have, as opposed to nurturing and really cherishing and appreciating what I do have, which all roots back to when I was a kid and feeling like I didn't fit in or didn't have what it took to be one of the cool kids or one of the people who did fit in. So I do still have those feelings. It's something I still work on, but in saying that, I'm very aware. There's times when I haven't been, and now at 43 I am very aware of those shortcomings in terms of why. The question's like, why do you want to fit in? Why would you want to fit in? Why wouldn't you want to be yourself and speak for yourself and have, your uniqueness show through? And that's there. And I know it's pushing through more and more all of the time, the older I get and the more aware I am and the more I talk about it. So it's there, but it's getting better. And, it's, listen, the amount of time I've spent talking to my therapist about some variation of that is not great. But at the same time, I am happy that I and recognize my privilege in being able to have those conversations with a therapist, but to be able to be open and honest about that, because in therapy, you only get the help that you're only able to get as much help as you're willing to share. Right. So if you don't share those things, those insecurities that really root back to, that's so that they're ingrained in you from childhood or whatever, if you don't address those or own up to, for lack of a better way of saying it, to those feelings, then you can't get help for it, because you're not being open and honest in those sessions. So I feel like that's another long way to answer that question, but 100%, that's the first thing that comes to mind when I read that question, for sure, is those feelings of insecurity and not enoughness. I'm going to do one more question. What is your biggest motivator when you feel like not doing it anymore? I have a tough relationship with the word motivation. And, I've listened to a lot of Mel Robbins' podcast around motivation and how it doesn't exist. And, it's funny, I've said this before, and I don't know that this is the root of the question, but it certainly lends itself to, in my mind, to thinking about ending your life, which is, I've shared before, I've had thoughts of suicide in the past. And, one of the things that has always been my motivator when I've had those thoughts is my mom. and knowing how 100% devastated she would have been had I chosen to take my own life. And I've shared that before. And, obviously since her passing almost 4 years ago now, I've had the thought, now what? Now who? Now what is the motivation for me to stay? Because she isn't here anymore. And obviously I have family, and my sisters are very near and dear to me, and my father and my husband and my family, my friends, all of those things. And I'm grateful for that. But I do want to recognize that, when you have those thoughts, sometimes those things don't, they aren't as clear to you as, I'm going to say should, as you think they should be. And oftentimes you can twist your thoughts when you have thoughts of suicide. You can twist your thoughts into thinking, well, they'd be better off without me. So even though you have those great things and they should be your motivators for staying, sometimes your mind can trick you into thinking that, yeah, I have those things, but they'd be better off without me here. So that's one of the horrible things about mental illness, is how your brain works against you in those moments. And in those moments now, especially where I don't have my mom in the physical realm here with me, I have her in my mind and in my heart. And so she's still pushing me through. She is the voice in my head. She is the compass, the anchor, all of the things that keep me going, because her love was strong enough to stay with me every day. And so if you do not have that person or that thing or that driver to keep you going and to make you feel whole and to make it make sense and to motivate you to stay, I strongly encourage you to reach out to anyone who could help. Somebody who might, if you're able to see a therapist and you have that capacity to see a therapist, please do. If you have a friend, if you have a husband or somebody that you haven't shared these things or these feelings with, please do. Reach out to me, reach out to somebody that you know who maybe experiences the same thing. I mean, I think when we go back to it and I think about how, why did I start this podcast or having these conversations? It's because some people can't, some people aren't there yet. Some people can't find that in them. And I'm not going to call it strength, because I don't think that's what it is. I just think for me, I have the capacity to do it. I have the privilege of being able to have these feelings and speak to these feelings and still feel safe. And I'm super grateful that I have that capacity to do that. Some people don't have that. So if I can be that voice or have conversations with other folks who also have those voices and those feelings and the capacity to share their stories so that they can hopefully touch somebody and make a difference, then absolutely, those of us who can should. But those of us who can't or can't find their voice or don't have the capacity, I don't want you to feel bad for not doing that, because I think in private, having those conversations with folks who can help you is more important. So I'm rambling a little bit, and I got a little bit distracted there in that last question, because maybe that's not what you meant when you asked the question. Whoever it was that asked that question, maybe it wasn't what you meant, but that's how I interpreted that question. If it was a much lighter question in terms of just quitting a job or, not continuing with a relationship or something along those lines, I just think communication is the key. Talking to people, whether it's the person that is directly impacted in that situation, if you're, deciding if you're going to stay in a job or if you're deciding to stay in a relationship, I think you need to find motivation by talking to others, find motivation from looking inside. Writing, I find, and I've said this many times, writing is a huge helper for me. I write when I need to get things off of my chest that I'm not able to share with other people, that I don't find it's even necessary to share with other people. I just need to get it off my chest. I write. Music is another thing that I've shared a lot that I love. just turning to music when I need it. If I need to have a dance party in my kitchen, I listen to the appropriate music for that. If I need to feel down and I want the music to be, commiserating with me, I listen to music that's a bit sadder. And I just think you'd need to find what works for you in those moments to motivate yourself to, turn on the TV and watch that comfort show so that you're not thinking about all of the things that you should be doing. Whatever that is, I think you need to find what works best for you. And if you need help with that, certainly reach out to somebody who can help you with that. And if you feel like you don't have somebody who can help you with that, I encourage you to dig deeper, because there's somebody there for you. And if that person is me, send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you all for listening to this, my first solo episode of season 4. And thank you to the Mental Health Foundation of Nova Scotia for supporting this season of my podcast. I'm thrilled through that funding to have my pal Jan McFarlane editing my episodes. And of course, as always, John Mullane has contributed the theme music. Thank you to everybody who makes this happen and who continues to tune in every week. Have a great week, and hopefully you'll tune in again next time.